Please, just for a few hours. I'll make it worth your while.
You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend?
On a cold morning in Washington, James, a young billionaire CEO, received a message from his parents. "We're coming over." His heart sank. The ultimatum was clear: marry or lose everything to his younger brother. In a panic, he rushed to his maid, Melinda. "Please pretend to be my girlfriend," he begged, desperation in his voice. She agreed, and as his parents arrived, they began to play their roles, James trying to hide the growing tension. But as the conversation grew intense, his father looked at him with cold determination and said, "James, if you want to keep your inheritance, you need to do more than just pretend. Propose to her. Right now." Melinda stood frozen, her heart pounding. Was this all just part of the act, or had they crossed a line? And what was in the file his father was holding? The secret it contained could change everything. Would James risk it all for a fake proposal? Or was there more lurking beneath the surface that no one expected? Stay tuned. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The large windows of James's luxury office framed a view of the city below, Washington in all its grandeur, bustling with life and ambition. But James couldn't see it. His eyes, sharp and calculating just hours ago in the boardroom, were now distant, fixated on nothing. He sat alone at his massive sleek desk, the dim light of the afternoon sun casting long shadows over the polished wood. His perfectly tailored suit felt too tight, as though it was a constant reminder of the man he was trying to be: successful, powerful, in control. But inside, he was far from that. The walls of his office, adorned with expensive art and opulent furniture, seemed to close in on him, pressing the weight of his thoughts deeper into his chest. He let out a slow, deep breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His mind, however, refused to be silent. It was flooded with memories, the soft laughter of a woman he had once loved. Her name was Emily, and for a time, she had been the world to him. She was the woman he had imagined growing old with, the one he thought would stand beside him in every triumph and failure. He had been willing to build a life with her, one filled with dreams and promises of forever. But that future had been shattered in an instant. Flashbacks of their relationship rushed to the forefront of his mind. The way her eyes would light up when they talked about their future, the late-night talks about starting a family, building a home together. It had felt so real, so destined. He remembered the laughter they shared over breakfast, the inside jokes, the promises whispered in the dark. They had been the perfect couple, the kind people envied. At least, that's what he had believed. But then it all came crashing down. He had come home one evening, eager to share the good news about a new business deal he had just closed, only to find a note on the table. It was from Emily, and it was over. Without explanation, without warning. Just a cold, impersonal note that left him reeling. "I'm sorry, James. I'm marrying someone else." Those words hit him like a physical blow, taking the air from his lungs. It was as if the ground beneath him had simply disappeared. There had been no argument, no fight, no indication that anything was wrong. She had just walked away. The betrayal ate away at him, gnawing at his insides. He had been left in the dark, blindsided by the woman he had given his heart to. It wasn't just the loss of her that hurt, it was the sense of being discarded so easily. She had been his world, and in a single moment, she chose someone else. The days that followed were a blur of pain. James had tried to reach out to her, to understand what went wrong, but she had refused to take his calls, ignoring his messages. He couldn't comprehend it. How could she just leave him without a word? The months that followed were the hardest of his life. He buried himself in work, threw himself into building his business empire, hoping that success would somehow fill the void she had left. But the pain lingered, a constant ache in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, of being replaced by someone else without ever knowing why. And so he did what anyone in his position might do: he locked his emotions away, behind a wall so high no one could ever breach it again. His heart hardened. The man who once believed in love, in the idea of building a life with someone, became a cynic. He no longer trusted anyone, least of all women. They were all the same, in his eyes. Deceptive. Unreliable. He would never allow himself to fall in love again, never risk the vulnerability that had once led him to give his heart away so carelessly. His heart belonged to no one now, not even to himself. His parents, concerned for his future, began pressuring him to marry, but he had no interest in fulfilling their demands. The weight of his inheritance, of the family legacy, pressed on him from all sides, but he couldn't care less. They nagged him about his duty to marry, about the importance of an heir, but he refused to entertain any romantic notions. He couldn't bear the thought of trusting anyone again, let alone getting involved with someone for the sake of fulfilling some outdated family tradition. He was consumed by the loss of Emily, trapped in a cycle of loneliness and emotional numbness. He would go through the motions of his daily life, attending meetings, making deals, smiling in public. But inside, he was empty. His colleagues saw him as the successful, confident CEO, the man who could do no wrong. But behind closed doors, he was a wreck. He had nothing left to give. In the quiet of his office, James let his thoughts linger on the woman who had broken him. He wondered what could have been. If she hadn't left, if she had stayed, would his life have been different? Would he still believe in love? Would he have been happy? But he pushed those thoughts aside, telling himself that he was better off alone, better off without anyone who could hurt him again. The pain of his heartbreak had become his armor, and he wore it every day, shielding himself from the possibility of ever feeling again. In his heart, he knew he could never go back. The man he had been, the one who had believed in love, in partnership, in forever, was gone. And in his place was a cold, ruthless CEO, a man who would never allow himself to be vulnerable again. James sat in his office, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his polished mahogany desk. The walls of his office, adorned with expensive art and trophies from his business triumphs, felt smaller today, confining, suffocating even. His mind raced, spinning between a mountain of decisions he had to make for his company, the clients he had to appease, and the mounting pressure that loomed over him like a shadow. The pressure wasn't just from the company anymore. It was from his family. James had tried to avoid the issue, tried to push it to the back of his mind, but with each passing day, his parents' expectations seemed to grow louder. The phone calls, the emails, the messages from his mother, each one more insistent than the last. And now, the ultimatum had arrived, as cold and forceful as ever. His parents, living in their luxurious Manhattan townhouse, were no longer satisfied with his success or his accomplishments. They wanted more. They wanted him to marry. They wanted him to give them an heir. He could almost hear his mother's voice from the other end of the line earlier that morning. "James, you're 32 years old. You need to settle down. You can't keep avoiding this forever. The family needs stability, and you need to give us a future." And then the threat, the one that had been hanging over him for months. "If you don't find a wife soon, we'll cut off your inheritance. It'll go to your younger brother." The words had hit him like a slap, cold and harsh. As though everything he had worked for, everything he had built, could be taken away in a single decision. And the worst part? He knew his parents would do it. They had always been ruthless in their pursuit of the family legacy, and James knew they weren't bluffing. His mind flashed back to the years spent in New York, growing up in the shadow of their expectations. His father, a man of immense wealth and power, had always expected James to follow in his footsteps, to continue the family business, to lead with strength and authority. His mother, ever the perfectionist, had taught him that family meant duty, and duty meant sacrifice. There was no room for weakness. There was no room for failure. Love had never been part of the equation. In the beginning, James had tried to make his parents proud, tried to meet their expectations. He'd worked tirelessly to prove himself to them. But now it all felt like a trap that was slowly suffocating him. They didn't care about his happiness. They didn't care that he was still hurting from the heartbreak of his first love. They didn't care that he had closed himself off to relationships after what Emily had done to him. No, all they cared about was his image, his status, and the continuation of their legacy. James felt trapped. He slammed his fist down onto the desk, the sudden impact causing the papers to shift. His frustration bubbled up, threatening to boil over. He had spent so much of his life focused on building something, proving his worth, only to have it dangled like a carrot in front of him, taken away the moment he refused to comply with their demands. He could already hear his father's voice in his head, booming with that tone of authority. "James, you're running out of time. We've been patient, but we can't wait forever. You must find someone, or you'll lose everything. The company, the inheritance, All of it will go to your brother. And then the silent threat, he's more than capable, you know. More than capable of taking over. The words stung, but they were true. His younger brother Jason was everything James was supposed to be, charismatic, charming, and eager to take over. Jason didn't have the same weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He didn't have the baggage of a failed love or a broken heart. Jason was free, and James was stuck. And now his parents had made it clear, if James didn't give them the family they demanded, his brother would be next in line. James knew he couldn't let that happen. His name, his legacy, everything he had worked for would be stripped away. The thought of his brother, who had never understood the pressures James faced, taking control of everything was enough to send a chill through his spine. But how could he go through with it? How could he marry someone just to satisfy his parents' wishes? He couldn't bear the thought of being with anyone just for the sake of fulfilling an obligation. The very idea repulsed him. Love was something he had buried, locked away after Emily's betrayal, and he wasn't about to force another relationship on himself just to appease their insatiable expectations. James stood up, pacing back and forth in his office, trying to clear his head. His phone buzzed on the desk, another message from his mother. He stared at it for a moment, feeling the weight of his family's expectations pressing down on him, suffocating him. His fingers hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. What was the point? No matter what he said, it wouldn't change their demands. They would continue to push him, corner him, until he either gave in or lost everything. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. James felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The family he had worked so hard to impress, the company he had built from the ground up, everything was at risk. And now he was being forced to make a choice: marry someone he didn't love to secure his future or risk losing everything he had built. As he stood there, staring out the window at the city that had become both his battleground and his prison, one thought consumed him: there was no way out of this. He had to comply, or he'd lose everything. The pressure was too much. The walls were closing in. And he knew deep down that his life was about to change forever. The phone buzzed on James's desk, breaking the heavy silence in his office. He glanced at the screen, seeing his mother's name once again. He could feel the tension in his chest tighten as he picked up the phone, hearing her voice on the other end, smooth and unwavering. "James, darling, we've decided to visit you this weekend," his mother said, as if it were nothing more than a casual remark. "We need to talk about your future. It's time you made a decision about your marriage, or we will have to act. Your brother is ready, after all." The words hit him like a punch in the gut. His parents had been pressuring him for months, but now, it felt different. This was no longer just an occasional conversation over dinner or an email here and there. This was them coming to confront him in person, face to face, to demand a decision. And James knew deep down, it wouldn't just be a conversation. They wouldn't give up until they got what they wanted. He dropped the phone onto the desk, his knuckles white from gripping it too hard. His head swirled with frustration and anger, the weight of his family's expectations threatening to crush him. He had no way out. If he didn't comply, if he didn't marry someone soon, everything he had worked for, the company, the legacy, the inheritance, would slip through his fingers. His younger brother, Jason, would inherit it all. He knew his parents wouldn't hesitate. Jason had always been the golden child, charismatic, charming, eager to take control. He'd never experienced the heartbreak that had frozen James's heart. Jason didn't carry the weight of their expectations like James did. Jason didn't know what it was like to be pressured into being someone you weren't. And now, he stood to take everything James had built. James's frustration bubbled over. His heart pounded in his chest as he paced around the room, back and forth, the walls of his opulent office closing in. His mind raced, thinking about the impossible situation he found himself in. He could feel the clock ticking, every second bringing him closer to the weekend visit. What was he supposed to do? How could he solve this? Suddenly, the answer hit him, one that felt as ridiculous as it was practical. It wasn't ideal, but it was a lifeline. In the years Melinda had worked for him, she had always been in the background, quiet, professional, unobtrusive. She had been nothing more than an employee, someone he barely paid attention to. But now, in this moment of desperation, she was the only person he could turn to. James glanced over at the doorway of his office, where Melinda had quietly entered earlier, preparing to serve him tea, as she often did. She was standing by the door, her head slightly lowered, waiting for him to speak. He swallowed hard. This wasn't going to be easy. He was asking her to step into a role neither of them had prepared for. But at this point, he had no choice. He needed her to help him, to pretend to be his girlfriend, to play a role that would buy him time, protect his future, and shield him from his parents' relentless pressure. "Melinda," James began, his voice strained, "I need your help. I need you to pretend to be my girlfriend." She blinked, clearly taken aback by the request. Melinda had always been professional, never crossing any lines or speaking out of turn. James had hardly ever spoken to her outside of the necessary work-related matters. And now here he was, asking her to play a part in a lie that could change everything. "I know this sounds crazy," James continued, running his hand through his hair, "but my parents are coming over this weekend, and they won't stop pushing me to marry someone. If I don't, they'll cut me off. They'll give everything to my brother." James paused, his breath shaky. He could feel the weight of his vulnerability pressing against his chest. He had spent so long keeping his emotions locked away, but now, in this moment of desperation, he couldn't hide it anymore. "I need to show them that I'm serious about settling down. I need you to pretend to be my girlfriend, just until they leave. This is the only way I can buy time." Melinda stood there in silence, processing what he had just asked of her. James could see the hesitation in her eyes. It was written all over her face. She had always been quiet, reserved, and this request was crossing boundaries that were not meant to be crossed. It was awkward, uncomfortable, and out of the blue. "Why me?" Melinda finally asked, her voice soft but steady. "Why ask me?" James looked at her, his gaze intense, full of frustration and desperation. He knew it was a big ask, but he had no other choice. "I don't have anyone else to turn to. I need someone who can handle this, someone who understands what's at stake. Please, Melinda. I'm begging you. I need you to help me." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. But after a long moment of silence, she finally spoke, her voice softer now. "I'll help you, James. But just for this weekend. This is a lie, and I know it won't end well. But I'll do it. I don't have a choice, do I?" James felt a sense of relief flood over him as he nodded. "Thank you. You don't know how much this means to me." Melinda's expression was unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. She agreed, but the weight of what they were about to do hung heavily in the air. Neither of them knew how this would unfold, but they were both trapped in a situation neither had signed up for. As she left the room to prepare, James leaned back against his desk, his mind racing with the weight of the decision. He had just asked his maid to pretend to be his girlfriend, and he knew the consequences would be far-reaching, whether they were good or bad. But for now, it was his only option. And as the weekend loomed closer, he realized this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything. The house felt different. The heavy air that had once filled the rooms with tension now felt more palpable, charged with the weight of an unspoken lie. James glanced around his luxurious home, trying to steady his breathing. His parents had arrived, and the charade was about to begin. Melinda, standing beside him, wore the same uncertain expression she had worn when he first asked her to play the part of his girlfriend. Neither of them had fully understood what they were stepping into when they'd made this decision. His parents, as expected, had begun with their usual demands and expectations. His mother's probing questions about when he would settle down had quickly escalated to a demand for a proposal, right there in front of them. His father had given James a hard, knowing stare, as if daring him to back down. "You know, James, if you're serious about this, you need to show it. Propose to her. We need to see commitment, not just words." James froze. The words were clear, but the weight of them hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about getting through this weekend, pretending for a few days. It was a demand, a test, an ultimatum. The weight of his parents' expectations felt suffocating, and he could see the pressure mounting on Melinda too. She was standing beside him, playing her part, but James could tell by the way her eyes avoided his that she felt just as unsure as he did. "James, if you're truly serious about her, show us. Propose right now," his father repeated, a steely look in his eyes. There was no room for negotiation. This wasn't just about saving his inheritance, it was about proving to them that he was ready to fulfill his role as their heir. He had to play along, no matter how much he hated it. The pain of his past heartbreak, The emotional walls he had carefully built around himself screamed inside him, but he couldn't let his parents see that. He turned to Melinda, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't real. They were both pretending. But as he looked at her, standing there in her maid uniform, the sharp contrast between the act they were putting on and the reality of their emotions became harder to ignore. For the first time in months, he felt a tiny flicker of something that wasn't cynicism or resentment, but a strange tug at his chest. He didn't want to feel this. He didn't want to get close to anyone. And yet, there she was, playing her role with quiet grace, making this whole thing seem like it could actually be real. Melinda, for her part, had agreed to this under duress, but now she could feel the tension in the air. She knew James was not the kind of man to share his emotions, to be vulnerable. She had spent years observing him, seeing only the confident businessman and never the man behind the mask. But as she stood there, pretending to be his girlfriend, something unexpected began to stir within her too. It wasn't that she had developed feelings for him, at least not yet, but she had started to notice things. The way his shoulders tensed when he was under pressure, the way his eyes darkened with frustration when his parents pushed him. There was more to James than the cold, distant CEO, but he hid it well. James. Melinda's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked at her, her hand nervously resting by her side. She wasn't playing the role of a damsel in distress, and she wasn't pretending to be someone else. She was simply trying to make the best of a ridiculous situation. The small, fleeting connection between them felt almost accidental. "I'll do it," he finally said, his voice low, as though the words themselves were heavy. He turned to his parents, and for the first time, the facade of cold indifference slipped for just a moment. There was no real joy in proposing to someone he barely knew, but his parents were waiting. They were watching, evaluating. James dropped to one knee before Melinda, his heart pounding in his chest. The gesture felt hollow, empty, but he could see the look in his mother's eyes as she watched. He had to do this. He had to follow through with the charade. As he looked up at Melinda, he felt a strange unease, an awkwardness that made his chest tighten. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't doing anything that would make this feel like a real moment. She simply stood there, her expression unreadable. James stammered for a moment, the words caught in his throat. How could he say this with any conviction when it was all a lie? How could he ask her to pretend this was real when it was nothing more than a means to an end? Melinda looked down at him, meeting his gaze with a quiet strength that surprised him. She didn't smile. She didn't say anything. She simply nodded, a small hesitant nod that told him she was playing along, even though she was as uncomfortable as he was. For a split second, James found himself wondering what this would be like if it were real, if he wasn't playing a part. But he quickly shut that thought down. "Will you marry me?" he finally said, the words leaving his lips like a mechanical response. The room was silent for a beat. His parents' eyes were wide with approval, and Melinda stood still, her lips pressed into a tight line. She hadn't said yes yet, because there was no question to answer. This wasn't about love. It wasn't about choosing each other. It was about survival. The tension in the room thickened. What was happening between them? James couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the lines between reality and their act were blurring. What would you have done if you were in James's shoes? Would you have gone to such lengths to avoid your family's pressure? How would you handle the growing emotional connection with someone pretending to be your partner? Leave a comment below. The days following the proposal were strange, full of awkward moments that neither James nor Melinda knew how to navigate. What had started as a simple ruse to please his parents had quickly spiraled into something neither of them had expected. The lines between what was real and what was fake began to blur. They both played their parts, James as the distant, emotionally closed-off CEO, and Melinda as his loving girlfriend, a role that felt increasingly unnatural as time went on. But something shifted after a few weeks. The evening had fallen silent, and the two of them found themselves sitting together in the living room, the only sound in the room the quiet hum of the fireplace. The tension between them was palpable, but neither spoke of it. James, who had been the picture of controlled coldness since the beginning of their fake relationship, now felt the weight of his own vulnerability pressing against him. "Melinda," he started, his voice quieter than usual. "I know this isn't real. We're just pretending for my parents. But I need to tell you something I've been carrying with me for a long time." He paused, his gaze faltering as he struggled to find the words. "It's about her." The her he was talking about, of course, was Emily, the woman who had once held his heart and then crushed it. He had never truly shared the pain with anyone before, not with his parents, not with his colleagues, and certainly not with the women he had briefly dated after Emily left him. He had never allowed himself to open up, to show the hurt that had been festering inside him for years. Melinda sat beside him, quietly listening, as James continued. "She was everything to me," he said, his eyes distant as he relived the past in his mind. "We were going to build a life together. I thought I had found someone I could trust, someone I could love without hesitation. But she married someone else. Without any warning. Without any explanation." His voice wavered as the words left him, the familiar pain gripping his chest. "It broke me. And I haven't been able to trust anyone since then. Not anyone." Melinda felt the weight of his confession settle between them. She had known James was hiding something more than the distant facade he wore. But hearing the rawness in his voice, seeing the way his shoulders slumped as he finally spoke about the woman who had torn him apart, made her heart ache for him. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to see him like this. She had only ever seen the powerful, composed businessman, the man who didn't need anyone. But now, she saw the man beneath that exterior. The man who had been broken by love and hadn't known how to heal. "I'm sorry," Melinda said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know. I didn't understand. But I can see it now. I can see the weight you've been carrying." She reached out tentatively, placing her hand gently on his arm, as if offering him the comfort he had so clearly been denying himself. James looked down at her hand, surprised by the gesture. It was the first time she had shown him such tenderness without pretending to be his girlfriend. He had expected a role played out of necessity, but now, in this moment, it felt genuine. His heart, for the first time in years, stirred. He didn't know why he had chosen Melinda to confide in, why he had let down his walls with her of all people. But he was grateful for it. She had shown him patience when he had expected nothing but cold indifference. "I didn't think I could let anyone in again," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "Not after her. But you've been different. You're not like the others. You've listened without judgment. You've given me space when I needed it. And I didn't expect to feel this way." Melinda felt a warmth flood through her at his words. She had agreed to this whole act out of necessity. She had never imagined that, in playing this role, she would begin to feel something more. At first, it had been easy to keep her distance, to remind herself that this was temporary, that she was just helping him with a family problem. But as the days passed, she found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't anticipated. The way he opened up to her now, the raw honesty in his words, made her see him in a new light. She hadn't been expecting this, but the connection between them, once only a facade, was beginning to feel very real. She had never thought of him as anything more than a demanding boss, the CEO who was too consumed by his work to care about anyone else. But as she looked at him now, she saw the pain, the vulnerability, and the softness he had been hiding for so long. It touched her deeply, more than she had expected. "I didn't expect this either," Melinda admitted softly, her eyes meeting his. "But I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad you trusted me enough to tell me." She hesitated before continuing, her voice quieter now, full of emotion. "I know this is complicated. I know we started all of this as a lie, but I can't ignore what's happening between us. I didn't plan for any of this, but I'm starting to feel things I didn't expect." James's breath caught in his throat. He had always kept his emotions tightly guarded, but in that moment, looking into Melinda's eyes, he realized that what they had was no longer just a ruse. Something had shifted between them, something real, something neither of them could deny. The tension between them was palpable, a magnetic pull neither of them could explain. And as the moment lingered, James felt a surge of emotion, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. Something that had the potential to grow. For the first time since Emily had shattered his heart, James allowed himself to imagine a future. And in that future he saw Melinda, not as a maid, not as an act to fool his parents, but as something more. He could no longer ignore the truth. The tension between them reached its peak, and neither knew where it would lead, but in that moment, they both understood one thing. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Call to action. If you were in Melinda's position, how would you have handled the growing feelings between you and James? Would you have stayed professional, or would you have let your heart lead you? Leave a comment below. The evening had a quiet intensity that neither James nor Melinda had been prepared for. It had been a few weeks since their last conversation, the one where they'd begun to blur the lines between what was real and what was just for show. The charade had become harder to maintain with each passing day. What had started as a mere act, pretending to be in a relationship, had slowly evolved into something that felt far more genuine than either of them could have predicted. James was standing by the large windows of the living room, looking out at the city skyline. The golden light from the setting sun bathed him in warmth, but it didn't hide the tension in his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. His mind was racing, trapped in a loop of conflicting emotions. He couldn't shake the feeling that what was happening between him and Melinda was no longer a facade, it had turned into something real. But the fear of acknowledging it, of stepping into the unknown, held him back. He had never been one to let his guard down, especially not when it came to matters of the heart. The pain of his past, the betrayal by the woman he had loved, still lingered like a shadow over his every decision. Melinda, sitting across the room on the couch, watched him quietly, sensing the change in the air. Her heart ached for him, for the man who had become so closed off to love after his heartbreak, and yet, she had started to see glimpses of the person he had once been. The man who could trust, who could love. But now, she wondered if it was too late for him to open up again. She had never expected this. The emotions she was beginning to feel for James were complicated, unexpected, and above all terrifying. She had come into this as a simple favor, a temporary act to save him from his family's pressure. But now, she couldn't ignore the truth. She was falling for him. And that scared her more than anything. James turned away from the window, his expression weary but determined. He had made up his mind. He could no longer pretend, not to himself, not to Melinda. He walked toward her, the quiet of the room making the air between them thick with unspoken words. "Melinda," he began, his voice soft, yet edged with emotion. "I've been thinking about this for a while now. I don't know when it happened, but," he paused, struggling to find the right words. "It's not just about the act anymore. I don't want to pretend anymore." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity but also fear. She had seen the way he had withdrawn emotionally for so long, and now in front of her, he was finally letting down his walls. "James, what are you trying to say?" He exhaled, taking a step closer to her. "I've developed feelings for you, Melinda," he confessed, the words coming out in a rush, as if saying them out loud would make them more real. "I know this started as a lie, as a way to appease my parents, but somewhere along the way, it became something else. Something I didn't expect. You've become so much more to me than just someone playing a part. You've become essential to my life. And I don't want to pretend anymore." Melinda's heart skipped a beat. His confession hit her like a wave, crashing over her with all the emotions she had been trying to keep at bay. She had tried to protect herself from getting too attached, from allowing herself to feel something for a man who had always been distant and cold. But in this moment, hearing him speak so vulnerably, everything she had been hiding from seemed to fall away. The walls around her heart, too, began to crumble. I don't know what to say," she said softly, her voice trembling. She stood up, moving closer to him, but she couldn't quite meet his eyes. She was scared. Scared of what this meant for them, for the life they had built in this temporary space. "I didn't expect this either. I agreed to this charade because I had to, because it was the only way to help you. But now," her voice faltered, "now it feels real. And that scares me, James." James stepped forward, his hand gently reaching for hers. "I know it's scary. I know this is all a mess. But I can't ignore it anymore. I care about you, Melinda. I know we didn't start this with the intention of building anything real, but now I can't imagine my life without you in it." The words hung between them, heavy with the weight of the truth. The room once filled with tension, now felt charged with something else, something new, something they both hadn't anticipated. There was a shift in the air, something palpable and raw, as they both faced the reality of what was happening. Melinda, still holding his gaze, felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She had kept her heart guarded, kept her emotions hidden behind the role she was playing. But now, standing here with James, she realized that what they had wasn't a lie anymore. She had started to care for him in a way that was deeper than just duty or obligation. "I'm scared too," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I never expected to feel this way. I never thought I'd fall for you. But I think I'm starting to. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, of shared vulnerability. They had both been hurt in the past, both afraid to open up, to trust. But in that moment, they were doing something they hadn't been able to do before. They were facing their fears together. James took a deep breath, as though the weight of everything he had been carrying had finally begun to lift. I don't know where this is going, Melinda. But I know I want to find out. I don't want to keep pretending, not anymore. Melinda's heart fluttered, and though she was still afraid of what this meant for them both, she couldn't deny the connection she was feeling. Neither do I, she said softly. But we have to be careful. This started as a lie, and now we have to figure out how to make it real. James nodded, his hand still holding hers. We'll figure it out together. As they stood there in the quiet of the room, they both realized that the turning point they had reached was more than just a confession. It was the beginning of something real. But with it came fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that their lives would never be the same. If you were in Melinda's position, how would you have handled the growing feelings between you and James? Would you have stayed professional, or would you have let your heart lead you? Leave a comment below. The weight of his parents' expectations had become unbearable. James had always done what was expected of him, followed the path laid out before him, built his empire, played the part of the perfect son. But now, sitting in his opulent living room, with his parents staring at him from across the room, he realized that he had lived his entire life for them, not for himself. The decision had been brewing inside him for weeks, but today, the boiling point had arrived. His parents were relentless. His mother, poised and insistent, kept pressing him about when he would get married. James, you've always been so focused on business. But it's time to focus on your personal life. You can't keep putting this off, she said, her voice soft but laced with authority. His father, the ever-dominant patriarch, nodded in agreement. The family legacy depends on you, James. You need to get serious. Your younger brother's ready to take over if you don't. The tension in the room was thick. James had heard it all before, but today, the pressure felt like it would crush him. He glanced at Melinda, who was standing by the door, her presence quiet but steady. She had been his rock through all of this, and now, she was the one he needed to stand by. But the time for pretending, for living the lie they had built, was over. James stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been avoiding this moment for too long, and now it was finally here. He could no longer hide behind the mask of duty and obligation. His parents had pushed him into a corner, and he had to choose, his inheritance or his happiness. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice shaking but resolute. His parents looked at him, stunned by the sudden shift in his demeanor. I can't live my life based on your expectations. I've spent years following the rules you set for me, but I'm done. I'm not going to marry someone just because it's what you want. And I'm not going to lose everything for the sake of your legacy. His parents' faces hardened, their expressions unreadable, but James didn't flinch. He had made up his mind. The weight of the years of pressure had been suffocating, and he was no longer willing to let that control his life. He looked directly at Melinda, who had been silently watching him, her heart pounding with both hope and fear. Melinda and I, James continued, his eyes never leaving hers, we've been pretending, yes. But what started as a lie has become something real. I love her. I can't pretend otherwise anymore. The room fell silent. James's words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. He knew the risk. He knew that revealing the truth about his relationship with Melinda could change everything. His parents could disown him, strip him of his inheritance, and sever ties with him forever. But in that moment, he realized that he was ready to let go of it all. He no longer wanted to live in the shadow of their expectations. He wanted to live for himself, for the future he could build with Melinda. Melinda stepped forward, her heart racing, unsure of what James's confession would mean for their future. But as she met his gaze, something shifted inside her. He had just laid bare his heart, his vulnerability, in a way he had never done before. And she realized in that moment that the feelings she had for him were not just fleeting. They were real. She stepped toward him, her hand gently resting on his arm. I've never asked for anything, Melinda said softly, her voice steady but full of emotion. But I've always believed that love isn't about obligation. It's about choice. And I choose you, James. No matter what happens, I choose this. James's heart swelled in his chest. He had been terrified to admit his feelings, to acknowledge that his love for Melinda was more than just a temporary solution to his family's demands. But now, standing in front of his parents, with Melinda's hand in his, he felt a clarity he hadn't known in years. His father, still silent, leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he processed what James had said. For a long moment, the tension in the room was suffocating, and James held his breath, unsure of what would come next. His mother's gaze softened, a small flicker of understanding crossing her face. She had always seen James as the perfect heir, the one who would carry on the family legacy. But now she saw something different in him, something she hadn't seen before, a man willing to live for himself, not just for them. Finally, his father broke the silence. His voice was gruff, but there was a new weight to it, a recognition of the change in James. I never thought I'd see the day when you choose love over legacy, he said, his tone softer than usual. But if this is what you want, then we'll respect it. James's heart skipped a beat. He had expected anger, disappointment, but what he had received was something he hadn't anticipated: acceptance. The road ahead would still be difficult, he knew that. His family would never fully understand his decision, but in this moment, they were giving him the space to choose his own future. His mother reached out, placing a hand on his. We may not agree with your choices, James, but you're our son. And we want you to be happy. Tears welled up in James's eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally free, free from the suffocating expectations, free from the duty that had held him captive for so long. As Melinda and James shared a quiet look, they both knew that this was just the beginning. They had faced their fears, their uncertainties, and together, they had chosen to build a future that was theirs alone. The family's blessing, while not perfect, was a new beginning, one built on love, trust, and mutual respect. As the weight of the past lifted from his shoulders, James took Melinda's hand, and for the first time, he looked ahead with hope. What would you have done if you were in James's shoes? Would you have risked everything for love? Or would you have chosen the legacy? Leave a comment below. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.